We could use your help keeping the Omaha History Podcast going. Please consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month. Go to patreon.com/Omaha. That's Patreon. It'll help pay the light bill.
Welcome to the North Omaha History Podcast with noted author and historian Adam Fletcher Sassy. Each week, Adam takes you on a guided tour through Omaha's dynamic past.
Did you know that North Omaha has at least 8 historic cemeteries, serving religious and ethnic populations as well as the general public? They're the final resting places of thousands of people from the 1840s through today. So tell us about that, Adam.
You know, Steve, pioneer towns had to have a couple of things right away, especially if they wanted to grow up and be big cities like Omaha did. You know, in Omaha, the ferry gets a lot of credit for being the first, and there's an old hotel that was right downtown, and the city kind of grew up around that. But few people acknowledge or realize that really the bedrock of Omaha's existence was a tall, lonely hill that sat above the cliffs. This hill, it was the kind of place that when the 1849 gold rush guys came across, they saw that hill and they knew that would be a good place to bury people. So they called it Prospect Hill because they were looking for the prospect of gold in California. And they started burying their dead up there in 1849. There were probably Indian burials that happened there before then, and of course lots of burials happened thereafter, because the whole place around 1858 was named Prospect Hill Cemetery. The first Omaha mayor, Jesse Lowe, set aside 10 acres of land for burial purposes that year. And the next year, 20 more acres were added. Well, eventually it all shifted around, and today it has a total of 17 acres. There are more than 12,000 burials there. And for the next 40 years after the cemetery opened, all of the city's most important people were buried there at Prospect Hill. You know, there's a little gatekeeper house right at the front of the cemetery keeper's house, and that's still occupied. And there's regular mowing of the lawn, and there's a association of volunteers who keeps up the cemetery. They pay for restoration work and, you know, make sure that the headstones stay up straight and go in every now and then and straighten it all out. That association lied dormant for a bunch of years, especially when Prospect Hill stood behind some public housing projects that were renowned for being violent. And when those projects stopped being there, folks came back in. They started taking care of it again. But, you know, Steve, part of the dilemma about Prospect Hill is that when people think of cemeteries in North Omaha, that's what they think of. In reality, there are so many more cemeteries, and I want to run down some of them. You know, one of the oldest ones was started in 1856. It was a private family cemetery for the Bird and Ritchie families that has at least 40 burials. Today, there's only one grave marker left on it, and it's on private land that's by 60th and Northern Hill Drive. It's a little bit like the Shipley Cemetery, although the Shipley Cemetery can actually be visited. You know, Shipley was started in 1861. That's the oldest known burial there. And it was started by the Shipley family, William Shipley himself. He buried his grandson, James, there that year in 1861. And since then, they've discovered more than 25 burials with the Shipley name that are right there. This is up in the Ponca Hills by County Road 49. And you can go and visit it today. There's a historical marker out front that talks about the Woosley family and a couple others that were right there. You know, Richard Woosley himself served in the Nebraska Cavalry during the Civil War. So there's some honorable burials that are right there in the Shipley Cemetery. Now, that's just one of the many. You know, we have Mount Hope Cemetery. It's a pretty popular place right there at 78th and Military in Benson. Mount Hope was opened in 1888, and there are more than 50 acres with lots of the old Benson families buried there, the families that are associated with the founding and real growth of Benson itself as it became a town and grew up. One of the most fascinating cemeteries, and of course one that gets credit for being the oldest formal cemetery in Omaha and in Nebraska, is the Mormon Pioneer Cemetery. It's up at 3301 State Street. And over the last 160 years, The Mormon Pioneer Cemetery has lived through a lot of infamy. At one point, people thought that there were more than 400 or 500 burials there. Today, there are some researchers who maintain that there are actually 30 or 40 burials there. But regardless of the number, the fact of the matter is, in 1846, the thousands of Mormon pioneers who were living on the shore of the Missouri River, they started dying off. They lived in rough cabins and shacks and soddies and tents along the river, and they just couldn't stand the rough weather that they were surrounded by in the winter of 1846 and 47. When they were buried there at the Mormon Pioneer Cemetery, their graves were marked with rough wooden stakes and piles of rocks, and they eventually disappeared. I mean, we lost track of where those graves specifically were. But today, the cemetery itself is maintained by the Church of Latter-day Saints, and even though there haven't been any burials there since 1953, people come from across the country and around the world to visit it and really see the legacy, the history that's in the Mormon Pioneer Cemetery. Another really old cemetery in North Omaha is called Forest Lawn. Of course, Forest Lawn is really the city's preeminent cemetery. It opened in 1885, and since then, there have been Grand Army of the Republic burials, Freemason burials. Even the Omaha Typographical Union had its own burial section there at Forest Lawn, along with the National Soldier Cemetery that's there. But lots of notable Nebraskan politicians and business leaders are buried there, as well as famous people too. Anne Ramsey, she was a Hollywood actress who starred in Throw Mama from the Train, is buried there. And folks can go and visit the Forest Lawn Cemetery out on Mormon Bridge Road today. One of the most interesting cemeteries, I think, in North Omaha is the old Springwell Danish Cemetery. It was opened in 1887, back on one of the old farms that was at 63rd and Hartman. Springwell Danish continued to grow after that, and hundreds of burials have happened there. It's fascinating to me because you can go and see several tombstones that are actually in Danish and signs of Denmark throughout the cemetery because of its history and its legacy as being a Danish cemetery. So that's interesting. And when we look across the span of things, you can also see more interesting cemeteries in the form of the Jewish cemeteries in North Omaha. You know, of course, at one time, and we've talked about this before on our podcast, but at one time, North Omaha had a thriving Jewish community that had all kinds of different fixtures and institutions spread throughout it. One of the oldest is the Temple Israel Cemetery. It was established in 1871 and was also called the Pleasant Hill Cemetery for a while. There are actually 3 cemeteries that are located right around here. One for Temple Israel, one for B'nai Jacob, and one for B'nai Sholem, each different synagogues that once existed. Many of Omaha's most notable Jewish leaders are buried there, including Emil Brandeis, who was the only Omahan to go down on the Titanic. The cemetery is active today. It's really well maintained, and it's respected by the surrounding neighborhood there on 42nd Street. Temple Israel was reached by a vertical road that used to go from, that actually still does, go from Florence all the way down to the cemetery. Today, that road is North 41st Street. Then it connected to Florence via North 39th, as we know it today, which shoots off of Northridge Drive. But it interests me because it's this road that goes from the northeast to the southwest, directly from Florence down to Temple Israel. We don't know why, but it did that, and that was the way that folks generally got there back in the olden days. Today, of course, you can just drive up 42nd and get to it. Golden Hill Cemetery has been active for this entire time, for decades and decades, 100 years, and was used mostly by the Russian synagogue that was in North Omaha, originally located out in some farmlands next to the town. Today, the cemetery is super full. It's packed with all kinds of great grave markers and tombstones and that are all written in Hebrew, and very, very beautiful, really well taken care of. And it's a nice experience being in the cemetery there. Another really interesting cemetery, and one that I kind of saved for the end, is Potter's Field. Potter's Field actually sits as part of Forest Lawn today. But back in the olden days, Potter's Field was on Young Street, right by Mormon Road in North Omaha. And it was a traditional graveyard for the poor from around 1887 through 1957 or so. The Potter Field was for people who didn't have the money to afford a proper burial. So Douglas County took it upon themselves to dig graves and throw folks in them. No tombstones, no grave markers. Instead, Potter Field was really just a place where bodies were kind of put. Well, from the 1960s through the 1990s, it was mostly neglected. The city of Omaha and Douglas County didn't really take care of it, and it grew over into a pile of weeds and small trees and different things like that. But in the 90s, it was rehabilitated as a meditation garden by the Florence Historical Foundation and the North Omaha Commercial Club. And today, it's maintained by Forest Lawn Cemetery at site. Potter Field is important for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being that it's the burial site of Will Brown. Will Brown, of course, was lynched in 1919 and had his grave marked in 1999 by a guy from L.A. who donated money and had a grave marker put in. That's kind of a summary of the different cemeteries in North Omaha. Prospect Hill, Bird Ritchie Cemetery, the Mount Hope Cemetery in Benson, the Shipley Cemetery up in Ponca, and Potter's Field just outside of Florence, next to Forest Lawn Cemetery, the Mormon Pioneer Cemetery also up in Florence, the Springwell Danish Cemetery, and the Jewish cemeteries of Temple Israel, aka Pleasant Hill, and the Golden Hill Cemetery. You can learn more about all those on the North Omaha History website at northomahahistory.com and in my book, North Omaha History Volume 2, that really gets into the history of those cemeteries. And that is a history of cemeteries in North Omaha.
Thanks for listening to the North Omaha History Podcast with noted author and historian Adam Fletcher Sassy. Join us next week as Adam takes you on another guided tour through Omaha's dynamic past.